Welcome to Coffee with Viking. I am Mike, also known as the Viking. Enoch, 89, and one of those four went to that white bull and instructed him in a secret without his being terrified, as he was born a bull and became a man and built for himself a great vessel and dwelt thereon. And three bulls dwelt with him in the vessel, and with very covered, and they were very covered. And again I raised mine eyes towards him, and saw a lofty roof, and 7 water torrents thereon, and those torrents flowed with much water into an enclosure. And I saw again, and behold, fountains were open on the surface of that great enclosure, and that water began to swell and rise again the surface, and I saw the enclosure till all its surface was covered with water, and the water and darkness and mist increased upon it. And as I looked at the height of the water, that water had risen above the height of the enclosure and was streaming over the enclosure, and it stood upon the earth, and all the cattle of the enclosure was gathered together until I saw how they sank and were swallowed up and perished in the water. But that vessel floated on the water, while all the oxen and infants and animals and asses sank to the bottom. And all the animals saw that I could no longer see them, and they were not able to escape, but perished and sank into the depths. And again I saw in the vision till those water torrents were removed from the high roof, and the chasms of the earth were leveled up, and other abysses were opened. Then the water began to run down into these, till the earth became visible. But that vessel settled on the earth, and the darkness retired, and light appeared. But that white bull would had become a man, come out of the vessel, and the 3 bulls with him. And one of these 3 was white like that bull, and one of them was red as blood, and one black. And that white bull departed from them, and they began to bring forth beasts of the field and birds, so that there arose different generations, lions, tigers, wolves, dogs, hyenas, wild boars, foxes, squirrels, swine, falcon, vultures, kites, eagles, and ravens. And among them was born a white bull. And they began to hire one another, but that white bull which was born amongst them begat a wild ass and a white bull with it, and the wild asses multiplied. But that bull which was born from him began a black wild boar and a white sheep, and the former begat many boars, but that sheep begat 12 sheep. And when those 12 sheep had grown, they gave up one of them to the asses, and those asses again gave up that sheep to the wolves, and that sheep grew up among the wolves. And the Lord brought the Devon sheep to live with it, and to pasture with it among the wolves, and they multiplied and began many flocks of sheep. And the wolves began to fear them, and they oppressed them until they destroyed their little ones, and they cast their young into a river and much water. But those sheep began to cry aloud on account of their little ones, and to complain unto their land. And a sheep which had been saved from the wolves fled and escaped, and the wild asses, and I saw the sheep, had they laminated and cried and besought their Lord with all their might, till the Lord of the sheep descended at the voice of the sheep from a lofty abode, and came to them and pastured them. And he saw the sheep which had escaped the wolves, and spake with it concerning the wolves, that it should admonish them not to touch the sheep. And the sheep went to the wolves, ascending to the world of the Lord. And another sheep met it, and went with it. And the two went and entered together into the assembly of those wolves, and spake with them, and admonished them not to touch the sheep from henceforth. And thereupon I saw the wolves, and how they oppressed the sheep exceedingly with all their power, and the sheep cried aloud. And the Lord came to the sheep, and they began to smite those wolves, and the wolves began to make lamentations, but the sheep became quiet, and forthwith ceased to cry out. And I saw the sheep till they departed from amongst the wolves, but the eyes of the wolves were blinded, and those wolves departed in pursuit of the sheep with all their power, and the Lord of the sheep went with them as their leader, and all his sheep followed him, and his face was dazzling and glorious, and trembled to behold. But the wolves began to pursue those sheep with the sheep till they reached a sea of water, and that sea was divided, and the water stood on the side and on that before their face, and their Lord led them and placed himself between them at the wolves. And as those wolves did not yet see the sheep, they proceeded into the east of that sea, and the wolves followed the sheep, and those wolves ran after them into that sea. And when they saw the Lord of the sheep, they turned to flee before his face. But that sea gathered itself together and became as it had been created, and the waters swelled and rose till it covered those wolves. And I saw till all the wolves who pursued those sheep pursued and were drowned. But the sheep escaped from that water, and went forth into the wilderness before there was no water and no grass. And they began to open their eyes and to see, and I saw the Lord of the sheep pasturing them, and giving them water and grass, and that sheep going and leading them. And that sheep ascended to the summit of the lofty rock, and the Lord of the sheep sent it to them. After that I saw the Lord of the sheep, who stood before them, and his appearance was great and terrible and majestic, and all those sheep saw him and were afraid before his face. And they all feared and trembled because of him, and they cried to the sheep with them, which was amongst them, We are not able to stand before our Lord, or to behold him. And that sheep which led them again ascended to the summit of the rock, but the sheep began to be blinded, and to wander from the way which he had showed them. But that sheep wot not thereof. And the Lord of the sheep was wrathful exceedingly against them, And that sheep discovered it, and went down from the summit of the rock, and came to the sheep, and found the greatest part of them blinded and fallen away. And when they saw it, they feared and trembled as its presence, and desired to return to their folds. And that sheep took other sheep with it, and came to those sheep which had fallen away, and began to slay them. And the sheep feared its presence. And thus that sheep brought back those sheep that had fallen away, and they returned to their folds. And I saw in this vision till that sheep became a man, and built a house for the Lord of the sheep, and placed all the sheep in that house. And I saw till this sheep which had met that sheep which led them fell asleep. And I saw till all the great sheep perished, and little ones arose in their place. And they came to a pasture, and approached a stream of water. Then that sheep, their leader, which had become a man, withdrew from them, and fell asleep. And all the sheep sought it, and cried over it with a great crying. And I saw till they left off crying for that sheep, and crossed that stream of water. And there arose the two sheep as leaders in the place of those which had led them, all fallen asleep. Lit had following asleep, and led them. And I saw till the sheep came to a godly place, in a pleasure and glorious land. And I saw till those sheep were satisfied, and that house stood amongst them in that pleasant land. And sometimes their eyes were opened, and sometimes blinded, till another sheep arose, and led them, and brought them all back, and their eyes were opened. And the dogs, and the foxes, and the wild boars began to devour those sheep, till the Lord of the sheep raised up another sheep, a ram from their midst, which led them. And that ram began to butt on either side those dogs, foxes, and wild boars, till he had destroyed them all. And that sheep, whose eyes were opened, saw that ram which was amongst the sheep, till it forsook its glory, and began to butt those sheep, and trampled upon them, and behaved itself unseemingly. And the Lord of the sheep sent the lamb to another lamb, and raised it to being a ram and leader of the sheep, instead of that ram which had forsaken its glory. And it went to it, and spake to it alone, and raised it to being a ram, and made it the prince and leader of the sheep. But during all these things, those dogs oppressed the sheep. And the first ram pursued that second ram, and that second ram arose and fled before it. And I saw till those dogs pulled down the first ram, and that second ram arose and led the little sheep. And those sheep grew and multiplied, but all the dogs and foxes and wild boars feared and fled before it. And that ram butted and killed the wild beast, and those wild beasts had no longer any power amongst the sheep, and robbed them no more of aught.